Hello and welcome to Diasperse, a new podcast, digital media platform, and YouTube channel where we discuss current events, pop culture, and public history on a local and global level.
My name is Desun and I'm a Cold War historian. I mostly focus on human rights memory in Asia Pacific and the United States.
I'm Rebecca Pierce. I'm a writer and filmmaker. I focus on human rights and racial justice issues from the US to Israel and Palestine. In today's episode, we're going to be introducing ourselves, the podcast, and some of the work that we'll be sharing here in the future. So in this first segment, we're going to go a little bit into our personal backgrounds, how we met each other, and why we decided to create Diasperse. Desun, do you want to talk a little bit about who you are, where you're coming from, and how you approach this work?
Sure. So my name is Desun, and I am a Cold War historian, and I look at human rights memory in Asia Pacific and the United States. And how I first came to become a historian was from my own family background, where my folks, my parents, moved from Korea and Japan, but they never really talked about exactly what happened in Korea and Japan that really made them leave those countries and settle in the Bay Area. And it was really only until college where I learned about histories of war in Japan and Korea, as well as a lot of the experiences that racialized and minority groups in Japan have experienced, namely Koreans in Japan who are called Zainichi Koreans. So I had a huge awakening in college, and I eventually linked up with other Zainichi Koreans in the Bay Area, learned a lot about the related struggles between racial minorities in the United States and Japan, and kind of dived into the history and politics of human rights across Asia Pacific. And that is how I also eventually met Rebecca. We shared this mutual interest in uncovering human rights histories and memories across the world, and we really found common ground in each of our families' backgrounds.
Yeah, and so similar to Desun, I have like a pretty complicated family background. My mom is a Black Christian woman, my dad is a white Jewish man. And for me, I always felt that these identities came together really well in a very natural way. But in a similar sort of, turn of events, when I got to college, I found that actually there was a lot of complexity and divisions between these communities, and a sort of assumption that you can't actually be both Black and Jewish. And also there's a lot of, we have our own things that we don't talk about in our communities or that are kind of taboo. A lot of my work is in Israel and Palestine and racial justice issues there. In the Jewish community, that's a very complex issue. We're going to get right into that in our next episode, but that's where a lot of my work is. And Desun and I actually met when we were 5 years old at Ohlone Elementary School in Palo Alto, where we both grew up, but we reconnected after college. And I think we both found that we were working in these kind of complex and muddy issues that we felt deserved more care and attention that they tend to get in our communities. And this episode is going to focus on one of the issues in particular that brought us together, and a project we're working on that is really the sort of foundation of the work Diasperse will be focusing on. So before we get into our project, let's talk current events. Desun, is there any current events happening that you think might be relevant to the issues we'll be discussing today?
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about the politics of Comfort Women. And the Comfort Women were, just to give a little brief background, were women who were trafficked by the Japanese military during the 1930s and 1940s. And what's very relevant about Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's resignation is that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is one of the biggest leaders in the right-wing political establishment of Japan, who has been actively denying the demands of the Comfort Women and the activists who are supporting the Comfort Women. So, a few weeks ago, he said that he resigned due to health reasons, but a lot of activists in Japan are wondering, what are the real motivations behind his resignation? And some have speculated that he resigned because he was trying to avoid being prosecuted by prosecutors in Japan. And what's significant about this is that Prime Minister Abe has been trying to field a lot of politicians, lawyers, persecutors that were aligned to his politics, and mostly right-wing politics and politicians who wanted to revise the constitution to allow Japan to have a military. So he's trying to kind of internally work within, trying to change the internal judiciary system of Japan to kind of align with his right-wing priorities. And of course, a lot of activists and the general public has caught on, and his approval rating sank, and he was eventually, and some folks have wondered maybe he actually left because his kind of internal reshuffling of Japanese judicial politics has failed and is trying to avoid prosecution. I think, going forward into the future, um, we're activists and the Comfort Women themselves, they're wondering, is Japanese denialism of Comfort Women still going to continue without Abe, or is there going to be a new leader in the whole denialism movement? So I think we're all eagerly kind of, awaiting the future of Japanese politics.
That's super interesting. And right away, you see a parallel to the US, where we have Trump, who may or may not be in office for much longer. We don't know. But we know the
Mhm.
problems of Trump predate him, and we'll continue to have to reckon with that. So it'll be interesting to see how, these two countries move forward in the
Absolutely,
future.
absolutely. Right, right. So, I think likewise with Trump, he's trying to appoint a lot of federal judges that are aligned to his politics. And I think a lot of authoritarian leaders are kind of have the same strategy of just appointing judges uh, and politicians, bureaucrats that are aligned to their goals. And apparently, in the case of Abe, it failed, but we'll see what happens in the future.
Yeah. All right. So now that we've talked about some current events, let's get right into our main segment, which is about our Comfort Women project. Over the past 3 years, Desun and I have documented the Comfort Women Redress Movement in San Francisco. Comfort women is a term used to describe girls and women who were trafficked into sexual slavery by the Japanese military during the 1930s and 40s. Historians have documented the state-sponsored trafficking of over 200,000 women across Asia-Pacific region by Imperial Japan during this period. It is one of the largest known systems of sexual trafficking in modern history. Since the end of World War II, activists across Asia Pacific have sought to remember and honor these women by demanding the Japanese state provide reparations and also by building memorials around the world. In 2015, activists in the Bay Area led a grassroots effort to lobby the city of San Francisco to construct a public memorial. The project immediately sparked controversy, encountering opposition from the Japanese embassy and some local residents, with the right-wing mayor of Osaka eventually breaking off sister city ties with San Francisco. After countless town halls and community meetings, the activists successfully built a memorial in Chinatown's St. Mary's Square in 2017. Our ongoing film project documents the political organizing that led to the construction of the memorial and explores the Comfort Women memorials around the world. In today's episode, I'm going to be interviewing my co-host Desun Oka, who is an expert on this issue, and he'll be diving into the historical context driving this movement. So Desun, to start off, can you talk about what introduced you to the Comfort Women organizing in the Bay Area?
Yeah, sure. So I first heard about the Comfort Woman organizing back in 2015 when I was a graduate student at San Francisco State University in the Asian American Studies program. And during this time, a friend of mine who was a member of a Bay Area-based Zainichi Korean civil rights organization joined a coalition of local activists to lobby the city of San Francisco to build a public memorial to the Comfort Women. So I attended a few city council meetings where the San Francisco Board of Supervisor member, Eric Marr, the coalition of activists, which was a diverse coalition of civil rights activists, feminists, Asian Americans, Jewish Americans, legal scholars, and many more individuals, as well as other San Francisco residents, to speak as to why San Francisco should build a public memorial. So some of these activists called on San Francisco to be a leader in the fight against human trafficking, while I think very importantly and tellingly, a lot of Asian Americans also spoke about the horrors of Japan's invasion of Asia during the 1930s and 40s, and cited this history as to why Japan should atone for its war atrocities, including the system of the Comfort Women sexual trafficking. But on the other hand, during these meetings, the coalition and a lot of speakers were met with a fierce opposition from the Japanese embassy, as well as some Japanese American residents. And the Japanese embassy, laid out their kind of key counter arguments, saying that the Japanese state has already apologized for this issue, that San Francisco has no jurisdiction over this issue, or that there is no apology really necessary because it's a resolved issue in their case. Whereas a lot of Japanese Americans also have Japanese American residents have cited that the resolution will somehow incite violence against the Japanese American residents. So, you know, seeing this kind of Comfort Women issue kind of bring together a broad coalition of activists, but also bring a lot of animosity to some members of the community, I kind of wanted to dive further into this issue. So, you know, one thing led to another, and I started combing through archives and spoke with activists who were involved with the Comfort Women issue since the 1970s. And I, in fact, found a very rich history of activism that kind of painted a different picture than the claims of like racial violence or pretty much claims of racial violence, or the notion that somehow San Francisco or Americans don't have jurisdiction over this issue. And I found a rich, so pretty much saying that I've found kind of loads of evidence that said that no, there's a lot of Japanese Americans that were involved with the Comfort Women issue, and Americans have been very much active players in remembering Japanese war crimes, and is very much an issue of American politics and public memory.
So can you talk a little bit about how historically Japanese Americans have been involved in Comfort Women organizing or bringing this history to light?
Sure. So actually, Japanese Americans have been a part of the Comfort Women story since day one. And this is shown in the history of Americans first encountering the Comfort Women. So specifically, when the US military swept through Southeast Asia and Okinawa, when they invaded these areas during World War II, they encountered a lot of Comfort Women stations. And when the US military met these women, they needed interpreters and translators. And several of these interpreters and translators were Japanese Americans, whose Japanese American second generation or first generation soldiers working in the US Army who knew English and Japanese. So they were the ones who were interpreting between the US military and the Comfort Women. And a lot of these interview transcripts were, you know, recorded, documented, and saved in US military archives. Decades later, in the 1980s, a lot of Japanese American activists and lawyers who were looking for evidence for their redress case for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Just to give a little background, a lot of Japanese Americans were placed into camps all across the West Coast. And it took until the 1980s where a bunch of Japanese American third generation folks decided that we need to address this historical wrong. And in trying to look for evidence of the evidence to build their case for redress regarding the Japanese American internment, they found these interview transcripts that Japanese American soldiers wrote and documented with the Comfort Women that they liberated across Southeast Asia and Okinawa. So what's interesting about this is that it was Japanese Americans who found evidence of the Comfort Woman a couple of years before the so-called first Comfort Woman came out in the 1990s in South Korea. So right then and there, like Japanese Americans have like been a part of the Comfort Woman story, even though we don't really talk about that so much. So anyways, fast forward into the 1990s, a prominent Japanese American activist who was involved in the internment case, decided that, okay, like we can't really let this history of the Comfort Woman go. We kind of have to actively kind of remember it and tell this kind of piece of history with other Asian American communities. So this one Japanese American, Dr. Clifford Ueda, an activist who was working in the internment case, decided to come together with Chinese American community leaders and started the Rape of Nanking Redress Coalition. And this coalition was an educational coalition that tried to teach the American public about the history of Japan's aggression in China, um, namely the rape of Nanking. But what's unique about this coalition is that Clifford Ueda and other Japanese Americans thought that, okay, we also need to remember the Comfort Women as a part of the larger memory of Japanese war crimes during the 1930s and 1940s. So it was like this connection of the Comfort Women memory with the memory of other atrocities that the Japanese military committed, and that these memories being held in Chinese American communities that really kind of contextualized the Comfort Woman memory and was able to lift the Comfort Woman memory in the consciousness of Asian Americans and Americans. Um, this kind of like consciousness building was able to bring kind of grassroots legitimacy to to then Assembly member Mike Honda's joint assembly resolution calling on the Japanese state to provide redress and reparations to the Comfort Women and victims of like rape of Nanking and other prisoners of war who endured violence by the Japanese military. So this was in the late 1990s when Assembly member Mike Honda passed a California state a joint assembly resolution. And then fast forward 10 years later, eventually Mike Honda brought a similar version of this bill to the US Congress. And it was at this time in the late 2000s when US Congress like picked up on this issue and said, okay, Japan needs to provide redress and reparation. So kind of zooming back and looking at the whole broader history of this, we can see that Japanese Americans have been the ones to not just discover evidence of the Comfort Woman, but are the ones who were able to politicize the history and the politics, able to politicize the memory of the Comfort Woman based on their kind of mutual relations and shared interest with their Asian American co-ethnics.
So that's really interesting that Japanese Americans have been so involved in this issue, and yet now the Japanese state is sort of claiming on their behalf that it's harmful to Japanese Americans to talk about the Comfort Woman issue. Can you talk a little bit more about this contrast between how the state has been operating versus how Japanese Americans have historically related to this issue?
Right. So the Japanese state, especially over the last 2 decades, and again, especially over the tenure of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, has been actively denying the politics of Comfort Women or the claims and calls for justice that activists and the Comfort Women have been making. So they pretty much state that Japan has either already apologized for this issue or that this issue is politically motivated and that it flies in the face of Japan's claim that they were waging a righteous war to liberate the rest of Asia from Western colonialism during the 1930s and 1940s. So the official opinion of the Japanese state is twofold. It has either apologized for this issue or that this issue is not really that much of an issue and it flies in the face and irrelevant towards the larger claim that Japan was actually waging a righteous war. And so Japan has demonstrated their assertion that Japan was waging a righteous war by pumping billions of yen into their public relations budget to correct, in quotations, historical inaccuracies regarding World War II. And that's obviously a reference to the Comfort Women system. And so the Japanese Foreign Ministry has sent ambassadors all across the world, and including, the Japanese ambassador to the United States, who said that his number one goal was to bring down the statues in the United States. And the Japanese consulate in LA has posted advertisements targeting the Japanese American community saying, oh, if your children were bullied, they bullied because they were Japanese and that Chinese or Korean children were saying that they were rapists or like that they were bad people because they're Japanese, let us know. No one has come forward with legitimate claims that their children were being bullied by Korean or Japanese children. Um, but I think this shows this assumption that the Japanese state has about Japanese Americans, that somehow their interests are aligned with the Japanese state, when in actuality, it doesn't consider the fact that Japanese Americans have historically, ever since they came to the United States, had relationships and intersecting interests with their Asian American co-ethnics.
Can you talk a little bit about how the comfort women themselves have been leaders in this movement for redress and reparations?
Yeah, so there's one very active surviving comfort woman, and her name is Grandma Lee, and folks in the movement and use the term and the endearment grandma to refer to these women. Um, and what Grandma Lee did was she called out and criticized the South Korean government back in 2015 for signing this kind of agreement with Japan, stating that the issue of the comfort woman was resolved once and for all. And I think Grandma Lee calling out the South Korean government kind of demonstrates the notion that just because you have two states agreeing on resolving the issue, that doesn't mean the victims of these atrocities themselves are okay or agree with whatever agreement states make. So I think like the comfort women themselves act as a good sort of check or litmus test against whatever agreement like South Korea and Japan make with each other.
What did she have a problem with about that agreement?
So the agreement, the 2015 agreement said that South Korea and Japan agree that they're not going to bring up this issue anymore and that it's resolved because Japan has paid a lump sum of money to the woman in the form of like a nonprofit foundation. Grandma Lee had a problem with this because it wasn't a formal state apology. And this is not what, and so she actually, turned down the money. She said, this is not what the comfort women necessarily want. The comfort women want a state level apology saying that, okay, this was wrong, that the comfort woman system was wrong, and that they pledged to never again establish this system, and that the public education system would reflect that pledge. So none of these were promised in the 2015 agreement. So Grandma Lee had a huge problem with that, and she pretty much said that she called out the South Korean government and said, "Why did you sign this? You didn't have the consent of most of the comfort women."
Wow, that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So earlier you talked a little bit about your background as a Zainichi Korean.
Mm-hmm.
How has that informed your perspective on this issue?
Right. So, I mentioned earlier that the Japanese state and society has this kind of growing cultural discourse about comfort women denialism, and it's been very active over the last 20 years. And a part of this discourse is this whole idea that, I'm summarizing a little bit, that Japan waged a righteous war in Asia to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. But the comfort woman system kind of is a blight against that assertion, but so is the existence of Zainichi Koreans. And so Zainichi Koreans are Korean colonial subjects who live in Japan, but after decolonization and after Japan lost Korea, these people became stateless. And for generations onwards, their kind of lived experience has been marked one of erasure of identity and statelessness and rampant discrimination. And so the fact that these folks exist and have been kind of a failed subject of Japanese imperialism is also a blight against the Japanese claim that Japan waged a righteous war to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. So as a Zainichi Korean, I kind of see the comfort woman as, okay, like we are both subjects that are kind of erased subjects of this Japanese social kind of claim, or like this Japanese discourse that, Japan has waged a righteous war. And so, but then again, like the fact that comfort women and Zainichi Koreans simply exist, kind of really contradicts that claim. And so like I view the Comfort Woman as you know, in sort of like this shared solidarity. It's like, okay, like, you know, we're both an inconvenience to the existence or to the claim of Japanese imperialism, and it's very important that our stories be recorded and heard. Otherwise, you know, the Japanese imperialism will kind of continue without any challenge or pushback.
It's really interesting. How is the Comfort Women movement a transnational struggle?
The Comfort Women movement is a transnational struggle because Japanese imperialism has expanded on multiple geographies and multiple territories and kind of crossed nation state boundaries. So in doing so, the system of Comfort Women trafficking has flowed across national borders throughout the 1930s and 40s. And as a result, you can't really remember the entire full picture of the Comfort Woman by just focusing on what South Koreans want or what the Japanese state claims. And to provide an example of this issue is that the first, very, very first Comfort Woman who came out publicly in the 1970s, before the first Comfort Woman, before what we think as the first official Comfort Woman who came out in the 1990s, was a woman in the 1970s in Okinawa who was a stateless, aka Zainichi Korean woman in Okinawa. And at the time, Okinawa was a US territory that was under occupation by the US military. So you have a stateless Korean woman in an occupied territory in Okinawa that was, whose history only came to light when Okinawa reverted back to Japanese control. So it goes to show that like there are subjects in the story of the Comfort Woman that don't really fit neatly in like kind of nation state categories, whether that's South Korea, Japan, North Korea. It's this stateless woman who kind of didn't fit in any boxes and whose story was the first to come out publicly. And I think this goes to show that we can't really view the Comfort Woman in terms of strict nation state boundaries, but rather we have to view this as a transnational issue in that the Comfort Women themselves are often people who do not belong to nation states, are stateless, and are themselves transnational subjects.
It's really interesting. And for Americans who might not be familiar, can you just give some context on like Okinawa and how this fits into like Japan's imperial history and maybe in other places like
Absolutely.
China and the
Yeah.
Philippines?
Yeah. No, thank you for mentioning that. I should provide some historical context. So, like I said, you know, part of Japan's waging a war of liberation against Asia was to invade Southeast Asia, Philippines, and China. What's in the middle of all these countries is Okinawa. So the Japanese military uh, placed a lot of military bases, equipment, and soldiers in Okinawa as a launch pad to invade the rest of Asia. But what comes in tandem with like the huge militarization of Okinawa was, of course, the institution of the Comfort Woman system. So, you know, historians have noticed that the islands of Okinawa have disproportionately held the most number of Comfort Woman stations compared to the rest of Japan proper. So, you know, a lot of Japanese soldiers were going through Okinawa, invading mainland China, Southeast Asia, and Philippines. And in doing so, brought a lot of like Comfort Women to the islands. But as we know, the United States entered the war and invaded Okinawa. But when the United States invaded Okinawa, which was a very brutal war that that killed a quarter of the population, a lot of these women were just abandoned. And the Japanese military just withdrew and left these women to fend on their own. So it only took until the 1970s, a couple of decades later, where a lot of historians and journalists are just finding out about the existence of Comfort Women in Okinawa.
Yeah, and I think for Americans, a lot of times when we hear like the word Okinawa, we'll associate it just with being part of Japan, and many people don't know that that was an independent community for a really long time that was
Yeah.
absorbed in the course of Japanese imperialism.
Yeah,
So thank you for
absolutely.
that background.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So can
And I
you?
think, go ahead. Go
Oh
ahead.
no, you go ahead.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think just to provide even more historical context, like Okinawa was also a colonial project of Japan. And during the course of the 1930s and 40s, in order to justify the huge amount of military presence in Okinawa, Okinawans had special imperial education by Japan, and and tragically, kind of this resulted in this hyper loyalty towards the Japanese Empire, and as a result, a lot of Okinawans killed themselves when the United States invaded. So even just Okinawa itself kind of demonstrates the tragedy and the extent of Japanese entrenchment in Okinawa's society.
Wow, that's just there's so much of this history that we don't learn in the United States that
Yeah.
I'm excited to keep diving into with you.
Mhm.
So let's talk a little bit about the memorials themselves. Through the
Sure.
course of filming this project, which is still in production, we were very early in
Mhm.
production when coronavirus hit. We were able to film memorials in Seoul, San Francisco, and Miyako, which
Mhm.
is part of Okinawa. Can you talk a little bit about these memorials and how they differed from region to region?
Sure. So the memorial in San Francisco, which was built in 2017, is a memorial where we see a Filipina, Korean, and a Chinese young girl on a pedestal, kind of holding hands with their backs to each other. And then just off to the side is a Korean comfort woman, an elderly Korean comfort woman, like looking onto them. And next to that woman is a plaque written in, I think, like 13 or 14 Asia Pacific languages, kind of briefly stating the history of the comfort woman. And so this statue in San Francisco kind of demonstrates the interethnic and international kind of character of the comfort woman, and the coalition that was involved in making this statue was very intentional about this and said that we want to have women representing all across Asia Pacific because the diasporas in San Francisco that are calling for the statue come from all parts of Asia. So, as a result, we see this particular statue in San Francisco. The one in Seoul is a little different. It's a Korean comfort woman with her hands clasped, sitting on a chair, looking at the Japanese embassy. And there's a protest every Wednesday where Koreans come and protest in front of the Japanese embassy, demanding redress and reparations from the Japanese state. And this statue kind of demonstrates this sort of post-colonial relationship between Korea and Japan. You know, this woman sitting in front of the Japanese embassy. The one in Okinawa, specifically, it's a memorial in a small island off of the main island of Okinawa called Miyakojima, is the only memorial in Japan, but it's significant because this memorial tells the collective memory of local Miyakojima residents' uh, memory of the comfort woman, and it tells the kind of the relationships that the locals had towards with their comfort woman neighbors. And remember, like Okinawa hosted a bunch of comfort woman stations, so Okinawans had like kind of often day-to-day contact with the comfort woman. And so right next to this memorial is another memorial that commemorates the extreme violence that Okinawa endured um, in August of 1945 when Okinawa was sieged by the US military. So what's significant about this memorial is that, number one, it's the only memorial in Japan. And it's the only memorial it's the only memorial in Japan because Okinawans had, the Okinawans on this island had a lot of frequent day-to-day contact with the comfort woman. And the comfort woman, as told by these Okinawan residents, suddenly disappeared when the Japanese withdrew from that island. So like the presence of these comfort women and the sudden disappearance of these comfort women is very much tied to Japanese militarism. So for these Okinawan Miyakojima residents, like the comfort woman is a component of their memories of militarism of the Japanese militarism regarding Japan and the United States. So these comfort women are kind of situated as a component of that memory. So like these three memorials, they're talking about one subject, the comfort woman, but depending on the local context, these memorials actually look very differently. Like San Francisco emphasizes the coalitional, interethnic, and international aspect of the memorial. The one in Seoul is symbolic and demonstrates the post-colonial relationship of the comfort woman towards Japan. And the one in Okinawa is tied to the memorial in Okinawa ties the comfort woman with the local memory of war and militarism that the Okinawans held during the 1940s.
It's really interesting. Is there anything else that you want folks to know about this issue before we sign off?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mentioned earlier how Grandma Lee spoke against the South Korean government in saying that, okay, the 2015 agreement is totally illegitimate just because you have two states saying that, it's a done deal. I want folks to know that just because nation states agree to settle an issue, that doesn't necessarily mean that this issue is settled for the victims themselves. And I think we see, for a lot of folks who are new to the comfort woman issue and like read news articles about the comfort woman issue, they think it's a South Korean Japan issue, but that's not necessarily the full picture. I think the comfort women come from all across Asia Pacific. And just because South Korea and Japan agree that it's a done deal, that doesn't mean it is a done deal for the rest of Asia Pacific or the comfort women themselves. And so when folks who are new to this issue read about this issue, I kind of wanted to say that you're not getting this full picture by just looking at bilateral relationships or international relationships. And I really encourage folks to be open-minded to the stories of stateless peoples or peoples who don't fit into kind of the boxes of nation states, and kind of be open to hearing their stories, because more often than not, it's stateless people who don't have a state who don't have like states backing them up, whose stories are not being heard. And I think in doing so, I think for when new readers and new historians read up on the comfort woman issue, I hope that they are not only just open to hearing the stories of stateless people, but kind of ask the historical context as well as to why these people are stateless. Like, why are there stateless people in Okinawa? Like, what happened in Korea where you had millions or hundreds of thousands of stateless people continuing to live in Japan and Okinawa? And so like I kind of invite people to kind of draw connections to the broader issue of Japanese imperialism, Japanese militarism, exclusive citizenships, and attached to that kind of exclusive narratives about the 1930s and 1940s.
So actually, I do have one more question, I realized. In the US, we have a really strong unfortunate history of rape as a tool of war. We've seen this used against Indigenous people.
Sure.
We've seen sexual violence around camp towns and military bases around the world. And we see this in a lot of conflicts. What does the comfort woman issue have to teach us about militarism and sexual violence?
Yeah, and I think what comes with militarism often, almost all the time, is sexual exploitation. So I think if we view militarism through the lens of sexual exploitation, that is able to tie like feminism with anti-militarism. And I think for folks who are working with issues of U.S. militarism, I think the next question, the supplemental question we can ask is, okay, who are the women and vulnerable people around these bases that are being impacted by U.S. militarism? And I think if we are able to legitimize their stories and their experiences, we have a very good case against U.S. militarism as a whole.
So these stories of militarism in Japan in World War II can teach us to look inward in our own society and ask important
Absolutely.
questions about what can we do to fight militarism and sexual exploitation.
Absolutely. And I think just even recently these days, like the US military in Okinawa, there were rapes that happened up until like the 1990s and 2000s. And of course, like how is it surprising? Like this happened already in the 1930s and 40s, the Comfort Women system. And I think once we start kind of opening that kind of uncomfortable histories, we're able to look at other US military bases around the world and ask, who are the people, who are the locals being exploited who are the locals being exploited to kind of upkeep this violent system? So I think the Comfort Women history can teach both feminist and anti-militarism activists an important lesson.
Thank you so much for this. Thanks to all our viewers. I know this was a difficult conversation. Thank you for joining us and listening, and hopefully continuing to learn after this episode. So if you want to keep the conversation going, like I said earlier, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Diasperse, or subscribe to the Diasperse YouTube channel and Patreon. Thanks again, Desun, and we'll see all of
Thank
you
you.
again very soon for another episode of the Diasperse podcast.
Thank you, everyone.